Now, of course, we're starting with the major breakthrough that appears to have come in this conflict that's entered its 7th week now. It is achieved in this ongoing Israel-Hamas war. That is a deal on hostage release.
It's a huge breakthrough, one which everyone has been waiting to hear of since the war started. Now, in the latest, Israel has approved an agreement to secure the release of hostages being held by Hamas. All details of the agreement have not been made public yet, but as per an Israeli government official briefing, deal is expected to see the release of 50 living Israeli citizens, mostly women and children, in groups of 12 to 13 people per day for 4 days in total.
Now, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has said that the deal, it's the right decision as he summoned his war cabinet. However, he did add that the war will continue.
יש בחוץ דיבורי הבל, כאילו אחרי ההפוגה להשבת חטופינו, אנחנו נפסיק את המלחמה. אז אני מבקש להבהיר, אנחנו במלחמה, ונמשיך במלחמה. נמשיך במלחמה עד שנשיג את כל היעדים שלנו.
Hamas senior officials had said the talks are at a decisive moment. US President Joe Biden also said they are very close to the deal. However, nothing is done until done.
While the deal is secured, relatives of Hamas-held hostages demonstrate outside Israeli Defense Ministry. Families, they're longing for the return of their loved ones. They protested in high anticipation of the deal, while some of them kept their hopes low and wished not to rely much on it.
Despite the negotiations, there has been little respite in fighting on ground though. Israeli army continues to release footage of operations in Gaza.
The Israeli military said that it had pushed further into a tunnel underneath the Al-Shifa hospital complex. It released an image of what it says is a blast door that was breached. The army also released a picture of the tunnel passage beyond the breached doorway. Elsewhere, the IDF has completed its encirclement of Jabalia, which is north of Gaza City. The army describes this as a significant combat area.
On the other hand, the military wing of Hamas released a video that shows militants planting explosives to target Israeli soldiers.
Now on Tuesday, BRICS nations convened an extraordinary summit to discuss the crisis in Gaza. The meet was virtually hosted by South Africa. The nations called for an immediate and sustained humanitarian truce in Gaza.
South Africa's parliament also voted in favor of a motion calling for the closure of Israel's embassy in Pretoria, as well as the suspension of diplomatic ties with the country. Now, it is up to President Cyril Ramaphosa's government to implement the decision. While chairing the BRICS meet, Ramaphosa accused Israel of war crimes and genocide.
The collective punishment of Palestinian civilians through the unlawful use of force by Israel is a war crime. The deliberate denial of medicine, fuel, food, and water to the residents of Gaza is tantamount to genocide.
Now, Israel's government has voted to back a deal for Palestinian Hamas militants to free 50 women and children held as hostages in Gaza.
And according to the Israeli Prime Minister's office, hostages will be released over 4 days, during which there will be a lull in the fighting. And the announcements are the most optimistic yet of a potential breakthrough in this conflict, which has raged on for almost 7 weeks. It's left thousands dead on both sides.
Now, Israel's Prime Minister Netanyahu told a meeting of his cabinet that accepting a deal for the release of hostages was a difficult decision, but it's the right decision. He stated that Israel will continue its war against Hamas even if a temporary ceasefire is reached with the militant group. Netanyahu also thanked the US President Joe Biden for his part in the deal to include more hostages and fewer crises.
במזרח ירושלים וביהודה ושומרון יש בחוץ דיבורי הבל, כאילו אחרי ההפוגה להשבת חטופינו, אנחנו נפסיק את המלחמה. אז אני מבקש להבהיר, אנחנו במלחמה, ונמשיך במלחמה. נמשיך במלחמה עד שנשיג את כל היעדים שלנו. לחסל את החמאס, להשיב את כל חטופינו ונעדרינו, ולהבטיח שבעזה לא יהיה שום גורם שמאיים על ישראל.
Now, sources from Hamas and Islamic Jihad, which took part in the 7th October attacks, disclosed details to news agency AFP on the condition of anonymity. They said that the tentative agreement would include complete ceasefire on the ground and an end to Israeli operations over Gaza, except in the north, where they would only halt for 6 hours a day. Under the deal, which the sources said could yet change, between 50 and 100 Israeli and dual national civilians will be released in exchange for some 300 Palestinian women and children currently held in Israeli jails. The proposed deal would also allow for up to 300 trucks of food and medical aid to enter Gaza.
ولكن أنا بعتقد أننا في لحظات حاسمة في هذا الأمر، وإحنا كلنا أمل إن شاء الله تعالى إنه تكون هذه الهدنة. إحنا هذه الهدنة المؤقتة التي بموجبها هو وقف العدوان أيام ودخول الإغاثة لشعبنا وتكثيف هذه الإغاثة، وأيضا بموجبها هي تبادل يعني المدنيين، نساء وأطفال مقابل نساء وأطفال من سجون الاحتلال. الخوض في التفاصيل هذا باعتقادي مش مفيد. المهم عندما ينتهي، لأنه نخشى الاحتلال يراوغ له شهر، وكلما اقتربنا من الاتفاق يعود إلى الوراء.
Hopes of a release deal have been mounting since Qatar stated only minor practical issues remain. Ahead of the meetings, Hamas leader Ismail Haniyeh had said, and I'm quoting here, "We are close to reaching a deal on a truce."
As stated in Arabic, we cannot comment on the details of the ongoing negotiations. We are working towards an agreement taking place, and we are now at the closest point we ever have been in reaching an agreement. We are very optimistic, we are very hopeful, but we are also very keen for this mediation to succeed in reaching a humanitarian truce.
The BRICS group of nations, including Russia, India and China, called for an immediate, durable and sustained humanitarian truce leading to a cessation of hostilities in Gaza. Here's what the US State Department spokesperson had to say.
We are very close to an agreement, but we are not there yet. As you have heard us say a number of times over the course of the past few weeks, nothing is final until everything is final. And at this point, everything is not yet final, but we are close.
Now, the hostages' families have demanded that Israel should insist on the return of all those being held. The religious Zionist Party, a part of the coalition government, has voiced opposition to the deal, denouncing it as bad for Israel's security, for the hostages and for the soldiers.
Some security experts have warned that a talked about 5-day pause in fighting could enable Hamas to regroup, and that Hamas's demand for the Israel Defense Forces not to use observation drones during that time could put Israeli soldiers at risk. The Israeli government is facing a dilemma, with their two top priorities being to secure the release of the hostages while dismantling Hamas. And the government's job will be to balance these two stated goals. This is Joe Jodie Cohen for WION World is One.
We're now joined by Bishop Garrison, a fellow at the National Security Institution at George Mason Law School and adjunct professor at Georgetown University. Sir, thank you so much for joining us on World DNA.
Thank you for having me.
Now, Mr. Garrison, Israel's cabinet, as I mentioned earlier, it's approved the hostage deal for the release of 50 hostages for multi-day ceasefire. This, of course, I don't need to say it, it is a major breakthrough. Talk to us about how you see this altering the course of this ongoing war.
Absolutely. Well, anytime you have hostages released in this type of situation, it's a good thing. Again, as we've stated, as others have already discussed on this point, though, Israel is still finding itself very much in a hot war with Hamas right now, with the terrorist organization. So this is a positive step forward. I applaud the Biden administration for being able to help support these efforts with Secretary Blinken and the president directly having a hand in this. But it is not over yet. It's not done until it's done, until not only we're able to get these hostages out of harm's way, but to get all the hostages out of harm's way. It was roughly a little over 240 that were taken on October 7th initially, to include Americans and Israelis within those numbers. So this is a very positive step forward, and we'll see some humanitarian aid, somewhere in upwards of 300 trucks per day moving in food and aid and fuel and supplies into the area, as you said, has been under a great deal of stress since this war began. But again, it is a step forward, not the final step.
It's definitely a step forward, Mr. Garrison. As you said, I want to take it a little further from there. Now, do you feel that the hostage deal and the frequent pauses, if there are more, and here's hoping that there will be more, will they help curb down the overall scale of the war, even though it will continue?
Of course, also important to mention now that the Hamas has welcomed this approval of the hostage release deal. That is the latest that is coming in. So that's another facet of this major breakthrough, that Hamas is now welcoming this deal to release hostages.
Well, yeah, well, it's a very, very valid question. Again, the primary point that we need to make here is to get the hostages out of harm's way. That will entail some amount of a negotiation, and that's what we're seeing exactly here. We're seeing aid come in because you still have other innocent civilians within the area, the vast majority of which, for both the hostages and other innocents caught in this, are all women and children. So we need to do everything we can in order to see these individuals taken out of the situation first and foremost. To the point about the use of drones and the concerns that any pauses may allow Hamas to regroup and to be able to shift their operations once again. That is an inherent risk with a situation like this. But in order to get those individuals safe, you have to take on some amount of risk in that regard. So we don't know until we see more of this play out. But again, strategists and tacticians on the ground are thinking through these things. And it's a very dynamic situation.
Right, Mr. Garrison, of course, as we speak, there are a lot of developments that are coming in. One, that Hamas has now welcomed this move. Also, from what we do know so far, as per reports that are coming in, the first hostage release would be on Thursday. That is, of course, a major development that has come in this regard. Netanyahu, however, earlier had clarified that this does not mean they're stopping the war. They will continue to fight until they achieve their goals. One, I think it's also important to understand and get some clarity on what their broader objectives here are. And would Israel be willing to have longer or more frequent pauses in this war going forward?
Well, that's a very valid question that I believe the United States, both in public and behind closed doors, are continuing to ask of the Israeli government, how many pauses are they willing to take on? How long are those pauses going to be? And what are the intended end state here? And what happens after this war is complete and those objectives or those goals are met? There's still a lot of questions that need to be asked here. But again, we have to continue to see this develop with some level of humanitarian support and aid taking place, because you have so many innocents that are now involved with this, and so many of them are women and children. So as Israel is continuing to think through its next steps, it has to take those ideas into account.
All right. Thank you for joining in, Mr. Bishop Garrison. Pleasure to have you here on World DNA with us.
Thank you for having me.